Hello? Okay. So thank you very much. I just wanted to provoke with a short question, and the idea is really listen to you and what could be your responses to what we have seen today and this morning. So the way in which the event was crafted put, I think, two ideas on the table very early in the morning before the 5 inputs or projects. No, the first one was that landscape it's more than plants, and landscape is a way. What Charles says, it's a way of thinking, and people that are willing to embrace new metaphors, new models for design and architecture. No. And then the second one that was placed by Ciro in his conversation with Mikkel was this idea of the radical, of what do we do when we have limited resources, and what is this deployment or emergence of landscape and design when we are in those contexts. So my question is very simple. We have seen many examples. How do you think they represent these two first intellectual provocations or things? And if there is something else that we should put on the table as an idea in order to frame better the question of landscape urbanism in the Americas?
After finishing with the presentations, my thoughts were architecture is a lot more than construction, no? And basically what we saw is that everyone is busy trying to pass the borders of what a project is, and trying to influence in the small scale and in the big scale with all sorts of actions. In a way, made me think that all the settlements started, origin with searching a place, and it's a way to try to return to the place in a way, just making places to walk, making the water return to the origin, like in a way using our hands and chopping wood. It seems that after being very busy doing a lot of things during a lot of times and spending a lot of energy, seems we are returning in a way to the local, but talking about the local in very good ways. There's a knowledge and there's a lot to take from. No, this is what made me think.
I have to say I was very relaxed coming here because I didn't have to do a presentation, but now I'm even more nervous as a respondent, just because I think that finding a way to continue this conversation in less than 15 minutes, seeing all these amazing projects and presentation is really a challenge, but I'm going to try. So I think it was very interesting to see in all these presentations, not necessarily explicitly, but very clearly in a way, the nature of landscape and its relationship to design and to the city throughout history. I think Mexico City is a very clear and very explicit example of how design has been an issue of domination, of imposition from our colonial history, which is still very present and very evident in the texture and the fabric of our city, about erasure and about distortion, about negation of not only natural conditions, but also social conditions that are part of the same sort of dark, violent logic. And this is the logic that most, or a big part of architecture and design as it relates to the city and landscape has been performed in our city through power, through political power, through domination, etc. And I'm very, I have to say hopeful. I'm not usually hopeful, but I am hopeful right now after seeing these presentations, because I think that Charles mentioned the origins of landscape architecture tied to this sort of pastoral, picturesque practice of landscape painting in the 19th century. And I think lots of architecture as it's still practiced today in Mexico specifically is even closer to that sort of picturesque, iconic, isolated logic. And it's hopeful for me today after seeing these presentations, because I do think, and the word paradigm has been thrown out in a couple of them, and I do think that we are witnessing the beginnings of a possible paradigm shift for the practice of architecture at the scale of the city in cities like ours. And that brings a little hope, because more than trees planted or more than metaphors thrown, it really, I think, points to a shift in sensibilities, in ambitions, and in possibilities for action for architects, which I think are very, very important, not only for the practice itself to maintain a minimal amount of relevance, but really for the viability of urban life as we know it and as we would like to know it today. And I think this paradigm shift goes from that notion of imposition and abstraction to some other words and concepts that were thrown in many of these presentations, like regeneration, remediation, reclaiming, reusing, and even reinstituting, not only physically and ecologically or biologically, but even socially and politically as well. So that, I think, is very, very inspiring. And it's also, I mean, the question would be, how can we make sure that we push this very sort of new sensibility into the mainstream? Because I think that's one of the greatest difficulties for architects, be it where they are in academia, in professional practice, in institutions, in these contexts that are very sort of paradoxical, I think, working in a government or with a government that closes off its main avenue for bikes on Sundays, but still dedicates a huge part of its investments to the worst type of infrastructural projects that we can imagine. How do you work and how do you push your view, your agenda, your beliefs or your paradigm against these difficulties? Or in universities where we have these incredible resources, knowledge and land in the case of the UNAM, but the university itself has very strong, evident disdain for these resources. I mean, I'm just thinking of the Espacio Escultórico scandal that the UNAM itself promoted. So I think it's very, very clear that these, or a competition that a government creates and then goes for a solution that is basically planting trees and putting up benches instead of thinking of this network or these different paradigms. So I do think we're in the midst of a new battleground for architecture, and I do think it has to do with fighting and pushing, and I think that's a good start, to have something to fight and push. So for me, that's where the hope lies. And I would just like to know how you, as practitioners, address this fight, basically.
Is that a question? Yes. And the question is a question for who?
For anyone. I mean, I hope it was relevant for any one of the presenters.
Sure. So if you have to open these to the presenters, any of you would like to just mention how you're addressing these new battlefields, or how do we take on this question?
Thank you. Well, I think first we have to go one or two steps down from this Olympus of the architect's world, because we have to work with people, but in the long term, as I said, in a process, we need a lot of time to sensibilize, to know the place, to understand dynamics, complexity. So we have to go a little bit more low, not fast as usually we do. First, and the next is we have to use media. We have to put magazines and television and of course it's the networks to give this knowledge to people and try to expect this knowledge in return, no? So we have to work with an input and something like that.
That's really interesting also because, and this is maybe a question for you as like a representing from academia, like when I think a couple of years ago, this conversation about starting this agenda, trying to identify what would be this landscape urbanism in the context of emergent urbanism, like of Latin America, because it used to be a conversation that happened like formally in academic environment between like Europe and the US, and there was this question that here in Latin America there has been some landscape, some people working on landscape, many architects working on landscape, but it's more from the perspective of practice, no? And we are defining all these new battlefields you were mentioning, and we have all these contexts of radical, extreme scarcity of resources, but again, like this imagination, this ambition to redefine some of the metaphors we put on our project. So now that I mean, this effort, like led by Charles, has been going on in many cities and really identifying practices and building a body of work that now we could even like mention as an effort for going through. How do you see the role of academia in permeating, in appropriating, like in Latin American academia, in appropriating all these conversations, given that we haven't had a systematic approach or a systematic approach to the discipline of landscape? Like we just now start seeing some programs, some universities, like we start, so as somebody coming from academia, how do you, and looking at these inputs also, how would you frame what's next?
There's effort. I think it's also very broken. But I think the main target should be understanding the actions of landscape more as an ecology, but social ecology. I'm more interested in trying to make permeable the ideas that working on the city in that way will create or will build communities, will reinforce social connections. And I think this is the main target that can be implemented in so many ways in the academia, even if it's not very clear as an area that are doing that research. I really think that the projects that we saw and the people that were teaching, we understand that as in a bigger scale in terms of the social impact, because this is what we are working with. I like to think about as a social ecology, because there exists a mutual benefit of all the elements that are inside. No, the corner that sells things, he will obtain a benefit if there's users, and if the use is more diverse, then more people will be there. So at the end, it's like a small piece of nature with all the actors.
It's very useful, and that takes me to another question that maybe for you. So one thing is, how do we start articulating conversation in academic environments that reflect what these people are kind of finding on the ground, no? But then is a third role, the role of the editor, of the curator. How do we package then this knowledge coming from their region, and how do we give also a form in terms of like exhibitions or books or articles or intellectual projects? So like from your perspective also, what will be, or what could you respond to that side of that edge of the problem?
I mean, as a non-architect, I think that very clearly the role is, for us, it's also part of this sensibility shift of a practice that was very close to itself, that spoke a language to itself and had conversations with itself, to a practice that now really needs and recognizes the need to embrace an audience that has no interest whatsoever or concern for design or architecture. So I believe that curatorial or publishing practices as they relate to architecture have a lot to do with this speaking a language that anyone can sort of relate to or respond to, and also finding different approaches than the traditional academic representational modes of thought and critique in architecture to a different view of how architecture impacts not only architects and their practice, but really everyday life and culture at different levels. So I think that as sort of being on the margins of the practice itself is something that's very evident, and I think it's slowly sort of seeping into academia and practice itself, as you know, architecture offices are more concerned about these types of sort of marginal approaches.
Okay, thank you. Hello? So, yeah. Okay, thank you. So it was great to just have this conversation with you and to have you all five like teams presenting now. We will move to the next moment of the show. So please. This is a difficult transition. So guys, yeah, thank you very much. Please give them an applause.